and welcome to Reading the Silver Eyes, Part 1. I'm going to start. We've got title page number 1, title page number 2, page full of static, and copyrights. Lots of copyrights. Okay, this is actually a really interesting thing about the copyright page is this. This book is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. And any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, business established events, or locales are entirely coincidental. I can't speak. So I'm going to start with Chapter 1. Chapter 1. He sees me. Charlie dropped to her hands and knees. She was wedged behind a row of arcade games, cramped in the crawl space between the consoles and the wall. Tangled electrical cords and useless plugs strewn beneath her. She was cornered. The only way out was past the thing, but she wasn't fast enough to make it. She could see him stalking back and forth, catching flickers of movement through the gaps between the games. There was scarcely enough room to move. But she tried to crawl backward. Her foot caught on a cord. She stopped, contorting herself to carefully dislodge it. She heard the clash of metal on metal, and the farthest console rocked back against the wall. He hit it again, shattering the display, then attacked the next, crashing against them almost rhythmically, tearing through the machinery, coming closer. I have to get out. I have to. The panicked thought was no help. There was no way out. Her arm ached, and she wanted to sob out loud. Blood soaked through the tattered bandage, and it seemed as though she could feel it draining out of her. The console a few feet away crashed against the wall, and Charlie flinched. He was getting closer. She could even hear the grinding of gears and the clicking of servos, even louder. Eyes closed, she could still see the way he looked at her. See the matted fur and exposed metal beneath the synthetic flesh. Suddenly, the console in front of her was wrenched away. It toppled over, thrown down like a toy. The power cords beneath her hands and knees were yanked away, and Charlie slipped, almost falling. She called herself and looked up in time to see the downward swing of a hook. Welcome to Hurricane, Utah. Charlie smiled wryly at the sign and kept driving. The world wouldn't look any different from one side of the sign to the other, but she made a nervous anticipation as she passed it. She didn't recognize anything. Then again, she hadn't expected to, not this far at the edge of town where it was all highway and empty space. She wondered what the others would look like, who they were now. 10 years ago, they'd been best friends. And then it happened, and everything ended, at least for Charlie. She hadn't seen any of them since she was 7 years old. They had written all the time as kids, especially Marla, who wrote like she talked, fast and incoherent. But as they got older, they had grown apart. The letters had grown fewer and further between, and the conversations leading up to the trip had been pre-functionary and full of awkward pauses. Charlie repeated their names to reassure herself that she still remembered them. Marla, Jessica, Lamar, Carleton, John, and Michael. Michael was the reason for this trip, after all. It was 10 years since he died. 10 years since it happened. And now his parents wanted all of them to come back for the dedication ceremony. They wanted all his friends there when they announced the scholarship they were creating in his name. Charlie knew it was a good thing to do, but the gathering still felt slightly macabre. She shivered and turned down the air conditioning, even though she knew it was not the cold. As she drove into the town center, Charlie began to recognize things. A few stores and the movie theater, which was now advertising the summer's hit blockbuster. She felt a brief moment of surprise and smiled herself. What did you expect? The whole place would be unchanged? A monument to the moment of your departure. Frozen forever. In July 1985. Well, That was exactly what she had expected. She looked at her watch. Still a few hours to kill before they met up. She thought about going to the movie, but she knew what she really wanted to do. Charlie made a left turn and headed out of town. 10 minutes later, she pulled to a stop and got out. The house loomed up before her, its dark outline a wound in the bright blue sky. Charlie leaned against the car, slightly dizzy. She took a moment to steady herself with deep breaths. She had known it would be here. An insolent look through her aunt's back bank books a few years before had told her that the mortgage was paid off and that Aunt Jen was still paying property taxes. It had only been 10 years. There was no reason why it should have changed at all. Charlie climbed the stairs slowly, taking in the peeling paint. The third stair still had a loose board, and the rose bushes had taken over one side of the porch, their thorns biting hungrily into the wood. The door was locked, but Charlie still had her key. She never actually used it. She took it from around her neck and slid it into the lock. Then she remembered her father putting its chain around her neck, in case you ever need it. Well, she needed it now. The door opened easily, and Charlie looked around. She didn't remember much of the first years here. She'd only been 3 years old, and all the memories had faded together into a blur of a child's grief and loss. And not understanding why her mother had to go away, clinging to her father at every moment, not trusting the world around her unless he was there, useless unless she was holding tightly to him, burying herself in his flannel shirts and smell of grease and hot metal and him. The stairs stretched straight up in front of her, but she did not move directly to them. Instead, she went into the living room, where all the furniture was still in place. She had not noticed it as a child, but the house was a little too large for the furniture they had. Things were spread out too widely in order to fill the space. The coffee table was too far from the couch to reach, the easy chair too far across the room to carry on a conversation. There was a dark stain in the wooden floorboards near the center of the room. Charlie stepped around it quickly and went to the kitchen, where the cupboards only held a few pots, pans, and dishes. Charlie had never had a lack of anything as a child, but now it seemed as the unnecessary enormity of the house was a sort of apology, the attempt of a man who had lost so much to give his daughter what he could. He always had a way of overdoing whatever he did. The last time she was here, the house had been dark and everything felt wrong. She was carried up the stairs to her bedroom, although she was 7 years old and could have gone quickly on her own 2 feet. But Aunt Jen had stopped on the front porch, picked her up, carried her, shielding her face as though she was a baby in the glaring sun. In her room, Aunt Jen sent Charlie down and closed the bedroom door behind them. She told her to pack her suitcase. Charlie had cried because all of her things would never fit into that small case. "We can come for the rest later," Aunt Jen said, her impatience leaking as Charlie hovered indecisively at her dresser, trying to decide which T-shirts to bring along. They had never come back for the rest. Charlie mounted the stairs, heading to her old bedroom. The door was partially cracked. As she opened it, she had a giddy feeling of displacement, as though her younger self might be sitting there among her toys and might look up and ask, "Charlie, who are you?" Charlie went in. Like the rest of the house, the bedroom was untouched. The walls were pale pink, and the ceiling, which sloped dramatically on one side to follow the line of the roof, was painted to match. Her old bed still stood against the wall beneath a large window, the mattress still intact, though the sheets were gone. The window was cracked slightly open, and rotting lace curtains wavered in the gentle breeze from outside. There was a dark water stain in the paint beneath the window where the weather had gotten in over the years, betraying the house's neglect.
Laura, you have to turn off the lights soon.
Charlie climbed into the bed and forced the window. Charlie climbed onto the bed and forced the window shut. It obeyed with a screech, and Charlie stepped back and turned her attention to the rest of the room, to her father's creations. Their first night in the house, Charlie had been afraid to sleep alone. She did not remember the night, but her father had told her about it often. The story had taken on the quality of memory. She sat up and wailed until her father came to find her, until he scooped her up and held her and promised he would make sure that she was never alone again. The next morning he took her by the hand and led her to the garage, where he had set work keeping her that promise. The first of his inventions was a purple rabbit in a gray with age from sitting in the sunlight. Her father had named him Theodore. He was the size of a 3-year-old child, her size at the time. He had plush fur, shining eyes, and a dapper red bow tie. He didn't do much, only waved a hand, tilted his head to the side, and said, in her father's voice, "I love you, Charlie." But it was enough to give her a night watcher, someone to keep her company when she could not sleep. Right now, Theodore sat in a white wicker chair in the far corner of the room. Charlie waved at him, though, but not activated. He did not wave back. After Theodore, the toys got more complex. Some worked and some did not. Some seemed to have permanent glitches, while others simply did not appeal to Charlie's childish imagination. She knew her father took those back to his workshop and recycled them for parts, though she did not like to watch them being dismantled. But the ones that were kept, those she loved, they were here now. Looking at her expectantly, Smiling, Charlie pushed a button beside her bed. It gave way stiffly, but nothing happened. She pushed it again, holding it down longer this time, and this time, across the room, and with the weary creak of metal on metal, the unicorn began to move. The unicorn, Charlie had named him Stanley for some reason she could no longer remember, was made of metal and had been painted glossy white. He trundled around the room on a circular track, bobbing his head stiffly up and down. The track squealed as Stanley rounded the corner and came to a stop beside the bed. Charlie knelt beside him on the floor and patted his flank. His glossy paint was chipped and peeling, and his face had given over to rust. His eyes were lively, gazing out at decay. "You need a new cone of paint, Stanley," Charlie said. The unicorn stared ahead, unresponsive. At the foot of the bed there was a wheel, made of patched-together metal. It always reminded her of something she might find in a submarine. Charlie turned it. It stuck for a moment, then gave way, rotating as it always did, and across the room the smallest door swung open. Out sailed Ella on her track, a child-sized doll bearing a teacup and saucer in her tiny hands like an offering. Ella's plaid dress was still crisp, and her patent leather shoes were still shone. Perhaps the closet had protected her from the damage of the damp. Charlie had an identical outfit, back when she and Ella were the same height. "Hi, Ella," she said softly. As the wheel unwound, Ella retreated to the closet again, the door closing behind her. Charlie followed her. The closets had been built to align with the slant of the ceiling, and there were 3 of them. Ella lived in the short one, which is about 3.5 feet tall. Next to it was 1 or a foot or so taller, and a third, closest to the bedroom door, was the same height as the rest of the room. She smiled, remembering. "Why do you have 3 closets?" John had demanded the first time he came over. She looked at him blankly, confused by the questions. "'Cause that's how many there are," she said finally. She pointed defensively to the littlest one. "That one's Ella's anyway," she added. John nodded, satisfied. Charlie shook her head and opened the door to the middle closet, or tried to. The knob stopped with a jolt. It was locked. She rattled it a few times, but gave out without much conviction. I'm looking for how long this chapter is. So I guess that I'm going to have to stop here because I don't think I can finish this chapter. So, bye.